Hey everyone, welcome back to the Deep Dive. We all want to learn new things, right? But who has time to wade through endless articles and books?
Especially when it feels like you're just skimming the surface, not really getting it.
Right, you're not alone. Today, we're going deep on generative learning.
It's all about moving beyond just memorizing facts. It's about truly understanding and applying what you learn.
We're going to give you the tools to learn smarter, not harder, so you can make the most of your time.
We're diving into a really insightful paper from Fiorella and Mayer, published in 2016, 8 Ways to Promote Generative Learning.
Yeah, we'll be extracting the key takeaways from their work, the need-to-know stuff, so you can start using these strategies right away.
To really understand how these strategies work, it helps to have some theoretical background.
Okay, so where do we start?
Well, one foundational idea comes from Whitrock's generative model of comprehension. He was writing back in the 70s and 80s. His central point was that learning isn't a passive process. You don't just absorb information like a sponge.
So it's not just about stuffing our brains with facts.
Exactly. Whitrock argued that we actively construct our own understanding. We build connections, we make inferences, and we draw on our prior knowledge to make sense of new information.
So what are the key ingredients of this active building process?
Well, Whitrock highlighted 4 main components: generation, motivation, attention, and memory.
Okay, let's break those down. What does generation mean in this context?
It's all about making connections. You make internal connections, linking different parts of the new material together, and you make external connections, linking the new material to your existing knowledge and experiences.
Right, because everything we learn builds upon what we already know.
Exactly. And motivation is, well, it's pretty straightforward. It's your drive to learn, your desire to make sense of things. It's what pushes you to engage with the material in the first place.
And attention. That's focusing on the important stuff.
Precisely. It's directing your mental energy to the most relevant parts of the new information and also to those parts of your existing knowledge that are most helpful for understanding.
In memory. That's where all our previous experiences and knowledge come in.
Yes, memory is the foundation upon which you build new knowledge. It's all your prior knowledge, your beliefs, everything you've learned and experienced. This is what you draw upon when you're making those internal and external connections. So as you can see, it's not just about passively receiving information. It's an active generative process.
So it's about being an active builder of knowledge, not just a passive recipient. The article also talks about the SOI model by Mayer. How does that fit into this framework?
Mayer's Select, Organize, Integrate model, developed more recently, really aligns with Whitrock's ideas. It provides a more detailed framework for how this active construction of meaning happens.
Okay, how does SOI work?
SOI suggests that meaningful learning involves 3 main cognitive processes. First, you select the relevant information from all the sensory input you're receiving. You focus on the key terms, the main points, the important visuals.
So selection is like filtering out the noise and zeroing in on what matters.
Yes, it's focusing your attention on the most relevant information. And once you've selected that information, it moves into your working memory, where the next stage happens.
And that's organize.
Right. In the organizing stage, you create a coherent mental structure from the information you've selected. You figure out how the different pieces fit together.
So it's like building a mental framework.
Precisely. You're making connections, identifying relationships, creating a logical structure that makes sense to you.
And the final stage is integration.
Yes, integration is where you connect the new information you've organized in your working memory with your existing knowledge in long-term memory. You're fitting the new pieces into your existing mental models, your understanding of the world.
It's like taking the new building blocks and integrating them into the larger structure of what I already know.
Exactly. And these 2 processes, organizing and integrating, are what Mayer refers to as generative processing in the SOI model. It's about actively constructing meaning.
So selection is focusing, organization is structuring, and integration is connecting. It's really interesting how these ideas build on each other.
They do. And it's worth mentioning how this all connects to Chi's ISAP framework. Generative learning, with its emphasis on organizing and integrating, aligns with the constructive and interactive modes of engagement in ISAP. It's about actively creating new ideas, not just passively taking in information. Simply being active, like highlighting text or taking notes without really thinking about the meaning, doesn't involve this deeper generative work.
So we've got this theoretical foundation. Now let's get to the practical stuff. What are the 8 strategies that Fiorella and Mayer highlight for promoting generative learning?
They've identified 8 key strategies that have strong research support. Summarizing, mapping, drawing, imagining, self-testing, self-explaining, teaching, and enacting.
Okay, 8 powerful tools to add to our learning arsenal. But how do they actually work? How do they promote generative learning?
Well, they all encourage you to actively make sense of information. They prompt you to select the most relevant points, organize them in a meaningful way, and connect them to your prior knowledge.
And the key takeaway here is that these strategies don't just help you memorize facts, they help you build a deeper, more lasting understanding.
Exactly. They help you understand the material and apply it in different contexts.
All right, let's dive into the first strategy. Summarizing. It sounds simple enough. What's the generative learning twist?
Summarizing, in the context of generative learning, means more than just writing a shorter version of a text. It's about identifying the most important ideas and expressing them in your own words. So you're not just copying or paraphrasing, you're actively processing the information and creating your own interpretation.
So it's about forcing yourself to really understand the material well enough to explain it concisely in your own language.
Precisely. And that process of selecting the key points, organizing them into a coherent summary, and integrating them with your own understanding is where the generative learning magic happens. You're actively constructing meaning.
And there's research to back this up, right?
Yes, there's a lot of evidence showing the benefits of summarizing for learning. One classic study from 1978 by Dr. O and colleagues found that having middle school students write one-sentence summaries for each paragraph they read led to significant improvements in their reading comprehension.
So even something as simple as a one-sentence summary can make a difference.
It can, especially for students who might be struggling with the material. And another study by Bretzing and Kulhavi in 1979 found that summarizing was actually more effective for learning than taking verbatim notes from a text.
That's interesting. It highlights the importance of actively engaging with the information rather than just passively recording it.
Exactly. And more recent research has also shown that summarizing can have metacognitive benefits.
Metacognitive, what does that mean?
It means that summarizing can help you become more aware of your own understanding. If you can't summarize the main points concisely, it's a good indicator that you might need to go back and revisit the material.
It's like a self-check to see if you're really getting it. Are there any limitations to summarizing as a strategy?
Well, like any learning strategy, it's not a magic bullet. It's most effective when you're working with shorter, well-structured texts, what we call expository texts. It's less effective for material that's very visual or spatial, like descriptions of complex processes or diagrams. It's much harder to summarize a diagram in words, right?
It makes sense.
Yeah.
A summary wouldn't capture the spatial relationships. And the article also mentioned that summarizing might require some training or guidance, especially for younger learners.
That's an important point. Just telling someone to summarize isn't always enough. Some people might need explicit instruction and practice in how to identify the key ideas and express them concisely and accurately. They might need to be shown examples of good summaries, and they might need feedback on their own attempts.
So summarizing can be a powerful tool, but it's important to use it thoughtfully and to provide support when needed.
Exactly.
Okay, let's move on to the next strategy. Mapping. It sounds a bit more visual.
It is. Mapping involves creating visual representations of the relationships between concepts or ideas. This could involve concept maps, knowledge maps, or graphic organizers.
I've heard those terms before, but could you clarify the differences?
Sure. Think of a concept map as a free-flowing web of interconnected ideas. You have key concepts, usually enclosed in circles or boxes, and then you draw lines connecting them to show how they relate to each other. You might even write a brief description on the connecting line to explain their relationship.
So it's like a visual brainstorm of how different ideas are connected.
Exactly. And a knowledge map is similar, but it's more structured. The types of relationships you can show are more limited and predefined.
And what about graphic organizers?
Graphic organizers are even more structured. They use specific visual frameworks like Venn diagrams, flowcharts, or hierarchical charts. They provide a template for organizing information in a particular way. For instance, if we wanted to map the definitions of concept map, knowledge map, and graphic organizer that we just talked about, we could create a hierarchical graphic organizer with visual mapping techniques at the top, and then branches leading down to each type of map with their key features listed below. So a concept map allows for more free-form exploration of relationships, while a graphic organizer provides a more structured framework for specific types of comparisons or processes.
So they're all about visually representing connections, but they differ in their level of structure. And how do these maps tie into generative learning?
Creating these maps forces you to engage with the material in a very active way. You have to select the most important concepts to include, organize them by figuring out how they relate to each other, and integrate them with your existing knowledge to create a meaningful representation.
So it's another form of translating information, but this time it's from verbal or textual form into a visual form.
Exactly. And that process of selection, organization, and integration is where the generative learning happens.
And there's research to support the effectiveness of mapping, right?
There is. One study by Chularut and DeBacker in 2004 found that high school and college students who used concept maps while studying text lessons performed significantly better on comprehension and transfer tests compared to students who didn't. And an earlier study on knowledge mapping by Hawley and colleagues in 1979 showed similar benefits for college students learning about geology. They found that students who used knowledge maps actually outperformed those who took regular notes, especially those students who had lower GPAs.
So mapping might be especially beneficial for students who struggle with traditional note-taking methods.
It could be. And a more recent study by Ponce and Mayer in 2014 showed that college students who used a specific type of graphic organizer called a matrix while reading about steamboats outperformed those who took conventional notes on both a summary writing task and a cloze test, which measures comprehension. So the evidence across different types of mapping techniques is pretty compelling.
It seems like it. And what are some practical tips for using mapping effectively?
The research suggests that mapping is most effective when learners receive some initial training on how to create effective maps. It can be helpful to provide examples, model the process, and give feedback. And because mapping can be a bit time-consuming, it might be beneficial to provide partially completed maps or templates, especially in more complex topics. This can help reduce cognitive load and make the process more manageable.
That makes sense. Okay, let's move on to another visual strategy. Drawing. It sounds pretty straightforward.
It does. Learning by drawing involves creating your own visual representations of the material you're learning. This could involve sketching diagrams, drawing illustrations, or even creating flowcharts.
So it's another way of translating information into a visual form, but this time it's more about creating pictures rather than maps.
Yes, and the process of drawing can be very generative. You have to select the most important elements to include in your drawing, organize them spatially, and use your existing knowledge to create a meaningful representation.
But the article also mentioned that the act of drawing itself could be a distraction if it's too difficult, or if you get caught up in trying to make it look perfect.
That's true. If you're not comfortable with drawing, or if you're overly focused on the artistic aspects, it can take your attention away from the learning content. This is called extraneous processing. That's why it's important to provide support and guidance, especially for learners who might not be confident in their drawing abilities.
And the research supports the benefits of drawing, even with those potential distractions.
It does. One really well-designed study by Schwamborn and colleagues in 2010 looked at ninth graders learning about the chemistry of washing clothes. They found that students who were instructed to create drawings to represent the process and who were provided with a pre-drawn background and easy-to-copy elements outperformed a control group on a transfer test.
So providing some scaffolding to make the drawing process less demanding can really enhance the learning.
It can. And research has shown the positive effects of drawing across a range of ages and subject areas.
What are some of the key takeaways from the research on drawing?
It's most effective when learners receive clear instructions on what to draw, when they're given specific guidance on how to represent the key concepts, and when they're provided with support to minimize the mechanical demands of drawing. Providing partially completed illustrations or using digital tools can also be helpful. The goal is to reduce extraneous processing and allow learners to focus on the cognitive aspects of translating the information into a visual form.
So clear instructions, targeted guidance, and support are key. All right, let's shift gears now to a strategy that's purely internal, imagining.
Imagining involves creating mental images of the content you're learning. It's like drawing, but it all happens in your mind's eye.
It sounds intriguing, but also a bit challenging to study. How do you research something that's happening inside someone's head?
It can be challenging, but there have been a number of studies that have looked at the effects of mental imagery on learning. These studies have explored everything from imagining procedures, like how to use a piece of equipment, to imagining scientific concepts described in text.
And how does imagining promote generative learning?
When you create a mental image, you're actively selecting the most important information, organizing it spatially, and drawing on your existing knowledge to make the image meaningful. It's similar to drawing, but without the potential distractions of the physical act of drawing.
But wouldn't it be easy to get sidetracked if you're not sure what to imagine, or if your mental images are vague?
Yes, that's a potential challenge. If you're not guided in what to imagine, or if you struggle with forming vivid mental images, it can lead to extraneous processing. That's why it's important to provide clear prompts and guidance.
The article mentioned a recent study that looked at imagining. What did they find?
In 2015, Leopold and Mayer had college students imagine different parts of the respiratory system as they were reading about it. They found that students who received specific prompts for what to imagine outperformed a control group on a transfer test. Interestingly, they also found that providing author-drawn illustrations actually reduced the benefit of the mental imagery prompts.
So in this case, external visuals actually hindered the generative process.
It seems that way. It might be because having the visuals provided reduced the need for students to actively construct their own mental images.
And what about who benefits the most from imagining?
Research suggests that imagining is often more effective for learners who already have a good understanding of the topic. It might be too demanding for those with lower prior knowledge, as they might struggle to generate accurate and helpful mental images.
So imagining is a promising strategy, but it's important to be mindful of its limitations.
Yes.
Okay, let's move on to a more familiar strategy.
Hmm.
Self-testing. We all know we should test ourselves, but why is it so effective for generative learning?
Self-testing, also known as retrieval practice or the testing effect, involves actively trying to recall information from memory. And that act of retrieval is incredibly powerful for strengthening learning.
So it's not just about checking whether I know the answer. The act of trying to remember is what makes the learning stick.
Exactly. When you try to retrieve information, you're forcing your brain to work harder to access it, and that effort strengthens the neural connections.
And the research clearly shows that this works, right?
It does. There's a huge body of evidence showing that self-testing leads to better retention than simply restudying or rereading. One classic study by Roediger and Karpik in 2006 had students either restudy a text passage or take a free recall test on it. And while the restudying group performed better immediately after the learning session, the self-testing group showed significantly better recall after a delay of 2 days or even 3 weeks.
That's a powerful demonstration of the long-term benefits of self-testing.
It is, and despite this well-established evidence, many students don't naturally choose to test themselves. They prefer to just reread or review.
Why do you think that is? It seems counterintuitive.
It might be because self-testing can feel harder and less productive in the short term. When you're restudying, you feel like you're absorbing more information, even if it's not really sticking. But with self-testing, you're confronting your gaps in knowledge, and that can feel uncomfortable.
But that discomfort is actually a sign that you're learning.
Exactly. And the research has also identified a number of factors that make self-testing even more effective.
Like what?
Well, providing corrective feedback after a self-test is crucial. You need to know whether you got the answers right and why. And repeated testing is also key. The more you test yourself, the stronger the learning becomes. And it's also important to match the format of your self-tests to the format of the final assessment.
So if you're going to have a multiple-choice exam, practice with multiple-choice questions.
Exactly. And there's been some debate about whether self-testing is as effective for complex problem solving as it is for factual knowledge.
So does it work for higher-level thinking skills?
The research is still ongoing, but the evidence suggests that self-testing can be beneficial for a wide range of learning tasks, including problem solving. The key is to design the self-tests appropriately.
And what are some practical tips for incorporating self-testing into our learning?
Make it a regular part of your study routine. Test yourself frequently and repeatedly. Use a variety of question formats. And most importantly, get feedback on your answers. And it's worth noting that many of the other generative learning strategies we've discussed, like summarizing and mapping, can also serve as forms of self-testing if you do them without looking back at the original material.
That's a good point. They all involve retrieving information from memory. Okay, let's move on to another strategy that involves active retrieval. Self-explaining. It sounds a bit like thinking out loud.
It is, in a way. Self-explaining involves explaining the material you're learning to yourself, as if you were teaching it to someone else. You might talk through the steps in a process, make connections between different concepts, or try to resolve any inconsistencies you notice.
So it's about actively engaging in a dialogue with yourself about the material.
Precisely. And that internal dialogue can be incredibly powerful for promoting deep understanding. When you self-explain, you're forcing yourself to select the most important information, organize it in a way that makes sense to you, and integrate it with your existing knowledge.
And there's research to support this, right?
There is a lot of it. One classic study by Chi and colleagues in 1989 found that college students who generated more self-explanations while working through physics problems performed significantly better on a subsequent problem-solving test. And another study by Chi and colleagues in 1994 showed that eighth graders who were prompted to self-explain a text about the circulatory system showed better deep understanding than students who simply reread the text.
So actively explaining things to yourself, even if it feels a bit silly, can really enhance your learning.
It can. And research has also shown that even when using effective learning tools like worked examples, the real benefit often comes from whether the learner engages in self-explanation. It's not enough to just see the solution steps. You have to actively try to understand why those steps were taken.
And are there ways to make self-explaining even more effective?
Yes. Research suggests that providing learners with prompts or guidance for self-explanation can be very beneficial. For example, you might ask yourself questions like, why is this step important? Or how does this concept connect to what I already know? And in some cases, explicit training in self-explanation techniques might be helpful.
So self-explaining is a powerful tool, but it can be helpful to have some structure and guidance.
Yes.
Okay, let's move on to a strategy that takes self-explaining to the next level: teaching. I imagine that teaching something forces you to really know it well.
It does. Learning by teaching involves explaining material to someone else with the goal of helping them learn. And this process of preparing to teach, explaining the material, and interacting with your student can be incredibly generative.
The article mentioned that the research on teaching is a bit more diverse than the research on self-explaining. Why is that?
It's because learning by teaching can take many forms. It could involve peer tutoring, where students take turns teaching each other. It could involve group work, where students work together to explain a concept to the group. It could involve presentations, where students prepare and deliver a lesson to the class. And it could even involve teaching a virtual pedagogical agent, which is basically a computer program designed to act like a student.
So lots of different ways to implement this strategy, but does the research support its effectiveness?
It does. While fewer studies have isolated the specific effects of the act of teaching on the teacher's own learning, the general consensus is that teaching is a powerful way to learn. One recent study by Fiorella and Mayer in 2013 found that college students who prepared to teach a lesson showed better immediate comprehension of the material than students who prepared to take a test on the same material. However, they also found that the most significant benefits for long-term retention were observed in students who both prepared and actually taught the lesson.
So the act of explaining the material to someone else, even if it's just a friend or family member, seems to make a big difference.
It does. And research by Roscoe and Chi has also shown that the quality of the explanation matters. Simply restating the facts isn't as effective as actively making connections, drawing inferences, and reflecting on your own understanding.
So it's about the depth of processing that teaching requires.
Exactly. And interacting with your student can also enhance the learning. Answering their questions, clarifying misconceptions, and adapting your explanations to their needs can force you to think more deeply about the material.
So even if we're not in a formal teaching role, we can still benefit from incorporating teaching into our learning.
We can. Try explaining a concept to a friend or family member. Prepare a presentation on a topic you're learning about. Or even just imagine that you're teaching it to someone else.
Okay, let's move on to our final strategy: enacting. This one sounds very hands-on.
It is. Learning by enacting involves engaging in physical movements or manipulations that are relevant to the material you're learning. For example, you might use gestures to represent concepts, manipulate objects to model processes, or even act out scenarios.
So it's about bringing the learning into the physical world.
Exactly. And this strategy has its roots in the theory of embodied cognition, which suggests that our cognitive processes are deeply intertwined with our physical bodies and our interactions with the world.
So it's not just about our minds. It's about our whole being.
Precisely. And when you enact something, you're creating a more concrete and meaningful representation of the information. You're selecting relevant actions, organizing your understanding around those actions, and integrating the new knowledge with your existing sensoromotor experiences.
And there's research to support this, right?
There is. A lot of the research is focused on younger learners, particularly in math education. For example, studies have shown that having young children use gestures while solving math problems or manipulate objects to represent mathematical concepts can enhance their understanding. And research on having students physically act out events described in a text has shown improvements in comprehension and recall.
So getting your body involved can really make a difference. But are there any limitations to this strategy?
Well, like any strategy, it's not a magic bullet. One potential challenge is that enacting can create extraneous cognitive load if the physical actions are too difficult or unfamiliar. This is especially true for learners with lower prior knowledge or skills, so it's important to provide clear guidance, feedback, and support.
So it's about carefully designing the enacting activities to ensure that they're appropriate for the learners and the learning goals.
Exactly. And another potential challenge is that while using concrete manipulatives can be very helpful initially, it's important to help learners transfer their understanding to more abstract representations. This is where techniques like imagery training and concreteness fading can be beneficial.
So you start with concrete, physical actions and then gradually move towards more abstract representations.
And overall, learning by enacting is a promising strategy, particularly for material that lends itself to physical representation. It's a unique approach that highlights the important role of our bodies in the learning process.
It's fascinating how all these strategies tap into different aspects of how we learn. So we've covered all 8 generative learning strategies. What are some of the key takeaways?
The overarching message is that these strategies can be incredibly powerful for enhancing learning. They all involve actively engaging with material, making connections, and constructing meaning. The research overwhelmingly supports their effectiveness across a wide range of ages, subject areas, and learning goals.
And the article also provided a useful way to categorize these strategies.
Yes, they can be categorized based on whether they primarily involve translation or elaboration, and whether they primarily rely on verbal or spatial processing. The translation strategies, summarizing, mapping, drawing, and imagining, involve converting information from one form to another. This process inherently requires you to select the most important information, organize it in a new way, and integrate it with your existing knowledge. The elaboration strategies, self-testing, self-explaining, teaching, and enacting, involve more active use of your existing knowledge to make sense of the new information.
And the verbal strategies are most effective when the material is less complex or when spatial relationships are already well understood. The spatial strategies are particularly useful for more complex or highly spatial material, especially in STEM fields.
That's a good general guideline, and it's also important to remember that the effectiveness of any strategy depends on how well it's implemented. The quality of the summaries, maps, drawings, explanations, and enactments matters.
So it's not enough to just go through the motions. You have to really engage in the cognitive processes that these strategies are designed to promote.
Exactly. And looking ahead, what are some of the exciting future directions for research in generative learning?
Well, one area of focus is on moving beyond just measuring recall and looking at more meaningful learning outcomes like comprehension, transfer, and long-term retention.
Yes, and researchers are also becoming more interested in understanding the cognitive and metacognitive processes that underlie these strategies.
So digging deeper into the how and why of generative learning.
Precisely. And there's also growing interest in the role of motivation and metacognition in generative learning. How can we motivate learners to use these strategies effectively? How can we help them develop more productive beliefs about learning?
And how do individual differences, like prior knowledge and cognitive abilities, influence the effectiveness of these strategies?
That's another important area of inquiry. And researchers are also exploring how learners choose and combine different strategies, how they adapt their strategies to different types of materials, and how we can best support them in using these strategies effectively.
It's an exciting field with a lot of potential to improve how we learn.
It is.
So to wrap things up, we've explored 8 powerful generative learning strategies: summarizing, mapping, drawing, imagining, self-testing, self-explaining, teaching, and enacting. These strategies can help you learn more effectively, understand more deeply, and retain information longer.
We encourage you to experiment with these strategies and find what works best for you.
Consider the type of material you're learning, your learning goals, and your own strengths and preferences.
And remember, learning is an active process. The more you engage with the material, the more you'll learn.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into generative learning. We hope you found it valuable.
We'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences. Let us know what you're trying and what's working for you.
Until next time, happy learning.
Happy learning!